Music was the most popular subject at Parkville, and there was a funny moment where a student said they wanted to learn about classical music, by which they meant Tupac.
The first music lesson I taught included Jay-Z, and I thought, I'm really getting with the youth here by including Jay-Z, and they just walked out. They said, Jay-Z is not 100, he's not 100% genuine.
This is Life and Faith, a podcast where we explore different conversations about religion with a capital R by talking with people about human experiences, ideas and loves. We believe that conversations stressing human things evoke, in the end, deeply religious questions, that all things tap, ultimately, into matters of life and faith. Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart. How would you go if on your first day in a new job, someone from that workplace threatened to stab you? Would you turn up for day two? Well, my guest today had that very experience, and he definitely thought about whether day two was an option, but he kept going and was eventually glad he did. Ralph Jackman had been a sports reporter for 25 years, but felt he needed a change, and in his early 50s trained to become a teacher. Well, that might be tough enough of a transition, but Ralph's first appointment was to Melbourne's Parkville Youth Detention Centre, teaching literacy and numeracy to boys on remand, teaching some of our country's most damaged and vulnerable boys. Ralph has written about that experience in his book Detention, a rookie teacher, the toughest prison school in Australia, where he narrates some amazing experiences he had in that environment and how he had to adapt and learn so much in order to survive and thrive. He also tells of the reason he came to be a whistleblower against a system he felt was badly failing those in its care. The book is out now, and I spoke to Ralph Jackman from his home in Melbourne. Ralph Jackman, so good to have you on Life and Faith. Thanks for being there.
Oh, thanks for having me, Simon.
Now, you became a teacher later in life. Tell us about your career change, how it happened, and how it came to be that your first teaching job was at Melbourne's Parkville Youth Detention Centre in the remand section. That was maybe a surprise to you, but certainly to others observing this.
Yes, it was a long road to teaching. I had thought about teaching for decades after leaving school. I had a gap year, had a great experience working as an assistant sporting master and sporting coach at a school in England. So teaching was always in the back of my mind, but I fell into sports journalism. That had always been a dream of mine. Sport, I was obsessed with sport as a kid in Australia, very typical upbringing in that respect. And I had a very enjoyable career, started at the ABC in Perth, was lucky enough to work in London and New York. After 25 years, I felt like a new challenge. I started a production company with an old broadcasting friend. That didn't work out as we'd hoped. So my wife then suggested, with a hefty mortgage and two young kids, perhaps it was time to revisit the idea of teaching. So I retrained to become a teacher. So this was in my early 50s. And I was expecting to become a history teacher at a mainstream school in Melbourne. The first interview that I was offered, though, was by Parkville College. And as I prepared for the interview, the more I looked into this school, the more something clicked for me. Just their sort of passionate belief that everyone deserves a great education, even young people behind bars. And I felt when I went for the interview that it continued to resonate with me. I really liked the people who were there. So when they offered me a job, I grabbed it.
The experiences you had there, honestly, are hair-raising. Describe for us the first day you walk in there. What are you encountering? Give us a feel for that.
Well, even before I arrived at the precinct on my first day, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. And I think my wife could sense that I was very anxious, very nervous. And she said to me, "Look, Ralph, it's not too late to pull out." And I sort of shrugged that off. I arrived at the precinct. The first thing you do is drop all your contraband items in a locker, so phone, umbrella. Then you walk through airport level security. My first interaction with people was in the key room, and it was two youth justice workers talking about one of their colleagues who was recovering from a head injury, had just had stitches put in their head after an attack by a young person. So at that point, the knot in my stomach grew even bigger. I made it to remand where I was teaching, and the first voice I heard came from over my shoulder, and it was a young boy, and he yelled out, "I'm going to stab you." I looked over my shoulder, and luckily the voice was coming from a locked cell, so feeling even more sick in the stomach. Turned up at our first staff meeting. All the teachers were addressed by the general manager of the precinct, and she apologised to us. She said, "Oh, look, this is a very turbulent time for the precinct. We've got a number of staff and young people recovering from serious facial fractures." And at that point, I'm thinking, why didn't I listen to my wife first thing in the morning? But luckily, things settled a little bit with an experience in the classroom later that day.
Yes, and I'll get to that in a moment because, yeah, I can imagine your wife's voice ringing in your ears at that point. It really is quite astounding what you experienced there. What kind of backgrounds did these kids come from? Many had traumatic backgrounds, right?
Absolutely. I mean, they say that the vast majority of the young people in Parkville have suffered some kind of acute trauma. Many of the young people were victims of abuse, victims of neglect. Some of them had witnessed family members killed in war. So the typical background was totally different from the very privileged upbringing that I had in Upper North Shore, Sydney.
I think on the first day or very early on in your time there, you found yourself in tears twice in this day, but for different reasons. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we were scheduled to teach 2 classes a day. So generally we taught literacy and numeracy to the boys. I had boys 15 to 18 years old. And for my first lesson, I prepared a class on poetry, alliteration and assonance. And the first thing I started off doing was introducing myself. So I was advised by my supervisor that it's quite good to be vulnerable to the boys, give them a sense of who you are, why you're at the school. So I told them a bit about my background. That lasted a couple of minutes. I felt like I was losing them already. And then I said, okay, how about we try some poetry? And straight away, universal response from all 6 of them was F that or dead haps. So dead haps was an expression I got to know well, which basically meant, no, that's not happening. Mm. So my first class ended after 2 minutes, and I went back to my supervisor and I started talking.
Because they can walk out, can't they? They just say, that's it, we're not doing it.
Absolutely. So you never argue with them. You never say, oh, look, boys, you're here for all 90 minutes. If they've had enough, they say radio back to the unit, to the staff who are with them in the classroom. And so long as things are clear for them, operations check that the coast is clear, they then go back to the classroom. So you never argue with them. So after that first lesson, I went to my supervisor and I started talking, and I think it was just the emotion of the first day, the fear and all the build up to it. I just started weeping in front of my supervisor. Mm. It was very embarrassing, but I managed to sort of pull myself together. My supervisor said, look, this is a very normal reaction. So I went back to the unit where the boys have their cells, where the boys play table tennis, play cards. And I said, oh, would anyone like to come up to my afternoon class? And everyone gave the same response, F that or dead haps, except for one kid. And I called him Jimmy in the book. Jimmy was 15 years old. His family had been ripped apart by drugs. He had had 50 changes of address since the age of 7. I spoke to my supervisor before the lesson. I said, look, I don't think assonance and alliteration is going to work with Jimmy. And she agreed. She said, look, Jimmy's got low literacy levels, but he may enjoy being read to. So I grabbed a book off the shelf. It was one that I recognised from home, a book called Horrid Henry, and I took it into the classroom and I said, oh, Jimmy, would you mind if I read to you? And Jimmy goes, no. And I said, this is a book that I've been reading at home with my daughter. And Jimmy had severe ADHD and he'd sort of been bouncing off the walls. But for the first time, he sat still and he looked me in the eye and he said, "You read with your daughter?" I said, "Yes, Jimmy." I started reading to him and I only got a sentence in. Jimmy stopped me and he asked exactly the same question. "You read with your daughter?" I said, "Yes, Jimmy." It was as though like the concept was beyond his comprehension.
Yeah.
And Jimmy goes, "How old's your daughter?" And I said, "Oh, she's 8. And he goes, "Can she read?" And I said, "Yes, she can, Jimmy." And then he looked at me and he said, "I really want to learn how to read." So there I was sitting opposite a 15-year-old who was pretty good at stealing cars, but he couldn't read the words education state on their number plate. And it was at that point that I thought, I've come to the right school.
What a challenge, and just for him to comprehend that someone would sit with their kid and read to them shows what a lack he'd experienced, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was the first time I saw, a lot of these kids are born with their hands behind their back, a totally different upbringing to the one that I experienced.
They were very tough on you too as a teacher. It sounded so difficult, Ralph. What made you stay in the role? You described the end of your first year as the most rewarding of your working life. I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, there were definitely moments early on when I thought, this isn't for me. I don't have a thick enough skin. There'd be more tears. And I found it very hard with, the teaching was great at Monash in terms of pedagogy and everything, but a lot of it just didn't work in the classroom. I had one experience early on where I had what I thought was a good lesson plan on writing cover letters. And I got 2 minutes into that lesson and one of the boys stopped me and I called him David in the book and he stood on his chair and then he got up on his desk. His feet were planted at shoulder width and straight away the image that came to my mind was the film Dead Poets Society and that famous "Oh, Captain, my Captain" speech.
Yes.
But there was something about David's expression that made me think, this isn't going to be a moment of student-teacher solidarity. And David, at the top of his voice, yells out, he goes, "Ralph, I'm making a stand. I'm making a stand against your classes. They're the most boring in Parkville College." And I went, okay. He jumped down from his desk and starts marching towards me. And as teachers, we wore what we called a duress alarm. So if you felt like you were in physical danger, you pressed that alarm and reinforcements would come into the classroom. But I just froze. And David kept coming towards me. He raised his hand and instead of hitting me, he snatched my whiteboard marker, walked over to the wall and wrote in giant capital letters, "F you, Ralph." So at that point, I thought, okay, I've got to jazz these lessons up a little bit. But in answer to your question, I think what really got me through those early weeks, those difficult weeks, were amazing colleagues, not just in the school, but also the Department of Justice workers who really served as great mentors to me. And I really felt that they had my back. So I really felt in physical danger because they were always beside me in the classroom. And they just gave me great advice on how to get to know the boys better and how to commit a little bit more. One of the youth justice workers, Stan, was like, he could be a tough teacher. And he said to me once, he said, "Ralph, you're not committing enough on the floor of the unit. You need to mix with the boys more. You can't just hang back on the periphery." And, I had real trouble getting into that circle and sort of relating to the teenage banter and everything. But he said, you got to play cards with them, play table tennis with them, just start chatting to them. It'll come to you. So having people like Stan really helped me survive those early weeks.
In many ways, you were trying to find a connection with these boys who had lives that were a universe away from yours. As you said, growing up on the North Shore of Sydney. But what was the most important way of bridging that gap?
First thing was really making sure that you listen to everything they say. The supervisor on the unit said that a lot of staff come in trying to make immediate changes or trying to produce a miracle change in these young people's lives. And she said the one thing that these boys aren't used to is adults turning up day after day and actually listening to them. So I made that sort of a bit of a simple goal, really, to when engaging them in conversation, if they said, oh, I'm a big fan of the NBA, I'm passionate about the Phoenix Suns, I'd take notes and make sure that I'd somehow tie that into the lesson next time. If we're doing numeracy, well, let's look at stats and what's the average score by the Phoenix Suns point guard, just as an example. But I think just listening to them, I've found that the boys were, very articulate and very willing to chat. And the most important thing was just making sure that you pick up on everything that they say and any goals that they had, for example.
Yes, and you did that amazingly. I loved hearing about your history lessons and the way you try to shape them in such a way that we connect with individual boys that you knew were interested in particular topics. I thought that was great. Just coming back to some of these challenges, what did it mean to have situational awareness, Ralph, in your job? Very different to most teachers, I would imagine, or most people, but how did that sort of apprehension of potential violence affect you in the way you approached what you're doing?
Yeah, well, I did find that most of the sort of burden for that rested with the youth justice workers, but on the floor of the unit, I was taught, how to spot signs that things weren't quite normal, that things were a little edgy. So Stan, for example, would tell me, look, if you see a boy with his back to the wall and he's constantly sort of tightening up his shoelaces, that's a good sign that things are about to kick off. So there were little tips like that, but really I felt that the youth justice workers were so good at their job. They had my back. There was one moment that I mentioned in the book where I had mistakenly said to the boys, you're going to get music tomorrow. They were very upset that they missed out on their music class. And I said, look, I'm sure you're going to get it tomorrow. I found out that music wasn't part of their timetable for the next day. So the boys suddenly had beef with me. And there were a few days there where things were a little precarious, but I always had somebody on my shoulder protecting me, and verbal threats were made to me, but managed to get through that thanks to the help of those youth justice workers.
Yes, you're very complimentary about them, and I think you had a real sense of appreciation for the work they did. Did some of them have lives that were closer to the boys' experiences than perhaps you had?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, quite a few of them had grown up in similar circumstances to all of the boys. Some of them had had brushes with the law when they were young. So people like Stan and Layla, who I mentioned in the book, had that natural empathy and that realisation that with all of these young people, you're really playing the long game. Stan mentioned that it took him 18 months to gain the trust of one of the young people in the precinct. So, yeah, hearing their stories and seeing their sort of natural affinity with the young people there was quite inspiring.
One of the things that struck me was the lack of continuity. So you'd be working with someone and you feel like you're making a bit of progress, and then they might be released or go to the next stage of what they were going through. But then sometimes they would come back. There was a bit of a cycle there. But was that a bit of a hard thing as a teacher in that situation?
Yeah, I did find it a hard thing. As a former sports reporter, I have very limited frames of reference, and my metaphors are usually cricket-based, as you discover in the book. But I described a lot of the experiences with these boys of making a start, and then when you're 25 not out, you've made a good start with the boys, suddenly they disappear, they're released, or they go over the wall to another unit. So there was that frustration of not having that longer continuity that most teachers would get in a mainstream school. But the recidivism rates were high, so the boys were sort of coming back in often. But often with those boys, you'd have to restart the connection. So that would take time. So there was that frustration there, but that's just the nature of the remand unit. It's a very fast-paced unit. Everyone passes through there. Some of them stay for only a few days, others stay for longer. And fortunately with, some students, I did get to work with them over a longer period, over a matter of months. But that frustration was there. And I often wondered, of course, we weren't allowed to make contact with the boys once they left the precinct. But I often wondered, especially with people like Jimmy, I wonder how they're doing. I wonder whether they're continuing with the reading or the numeracy or whatever we made a little bit of progress on. when they were in the precinct.
This is Life and Faith, and I'm speaking with Ralph Jackman about his experiences as a teacher in the Parkville Youth Detention Centre in Melbourne. You'll hear in this part of the interview how creative Ralph had to become to keep the attention of the boys he was teaching and to make progress with them. Also, how vulnerable he had to be in telling his own story in order to make a connection with the boys.
The boys were always very open with their own stories with me, and there was one moment when I'd got to know a group of boys quite well. They'd been in for about 6 weeks, and they said to me, Ralph, you're always asking us questions and we're telling you all about us, but we want to hear more about you. What's your story? So I had, one incredible class with them where I took the chair and sat in front of the whiteboard and I said, okay, boys, you've asked me to answer some of your questions. Here's your chance. Interview me for the next hour. And they asked a huge range of questions and quite probing, and they asked, what's the happiest day of your life? What's the saddest day of your life? And I felt compelled to tell them some quite personal stories, to be quite vulnerable with them. But I felt, well, that's the least I can do. They've told me their stories. So I responded in kind, and they seemed to respond well to that. And, I talked about sitting next to my dad in church and responding to the story of the Good Samaritan. And I tied that in, that feeling that I had when sitting next to my dad, enjoying those parables that were told in church, with the feeling I got when I listened to the Aboriginal cultural officer telling a creation story in class and the similar effect that had on me. So, yeah, one thing I think I came away with from Parkville was that sense of the power of the universal in great storytelling from all different cultures.
Ralph, I noted in your book that story you told of sitting in church with your dad and being a bit of an endurance test, but that the parables kind of stayed with you, and especially the Good Samaritan. What was it about the Good Samaritan story that stayed with you? Because I feel like it did, and perhaps was having some sort of influence even in this work that you did as a teacher in that situation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think writing the book helped me reflect on why stories like that did resonate with me. I did root for the underdog when I was a kid. I talked about going for the teams that Australia used to wallop in cricket. I'd support India or England, whoever it was. But I felt that the Good Samaritan just told so many great lessons that also tied into what I experienced in the precinct. This love for other people, compassion for others who may be from different backgrounds, different cultures, or have different beliefs, but also the importance of taking action, of not just expressing your beliefs, but being committed to some kind of action to help your fellow man. And I also felt, from what I can remember about the story, the Samaritans were marginalised and demonised. And I love the way the Samaritan plays the central role, this demonised or marginalised person. So I felt that really tied in with my experience in the precinct, because I thought that's something we have to challenge our own biases and look beyond our own perspective to those people, especially those who are marginalised and demonised in our own society, like those in youth justice.
Ralph, do you have a memory of a favourite lesson you taught? You mentioned some of them in the book, including the role playing of Kennedy's assassination, which I thought was good fun, and some of them where they'd be bringing things into the classroom from their experiences of stealing cars and gang stuff that would be perhaps unconventional. Yeah.
Well, one lesson that sticks in my mind was one of the boys requested a lesson on Ned Kelly. So I knew from the early lesson with David that you got to get the boys active. So when the boys came into the class, they're looking around, they're wondering why the tables were all on their side and the chairs were upturned. And I'd set up 2 barricades. So we reenacted the last stand at Glen Rowan. And the first activity they did was I had sheets of black cardboard. I got them to make their own Ned Kelly helmets. And I tied in a bit of numeracy with that. So we did the volume of a cylinder. And then I said, okay, boys, you got your helmets, put those on. It's going to be staff versus students. This is the last stand at Glenrowan. So the boys, of course, wanted to be the Kelly gang, and me and the justice workers were Team Victoria Police. So I said, here's your ammunition. And I had some plastic golf balls, practice golf balls. So everyone armed themselves with half a dozen of those, hid behind our respective barriers. And, on the count 3, 2, 1, we all stood up and threw plastic golf balls at each other's cardboard Ned Kelly helmets. So that was one of the most fun lessons, I think.
I'm sure they never forgot that. That's great creativity. And you had to do this a lot, right? There was no way you could just walk in and lecture them. You had to find a way to connect.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the Kennedy assassination lesson. The boys were right into their conspiracy theories, and one of them knew everything about the Kennedy assassination, convinced it was the CIA. So we did a reenactment there as well. Had the motorcade, the presidential motorcade with 1980 style ergonomic chair on wheels, pushing Kennedy along the route in Dallas on that infamous day. And I thought, there's that key figure, the umbrella man, who, on this beautiful sunny day in Dallas, just before Kennedy is shot, a man in a suit opens an umbrella. And there were a lot of conspiracy theories about, is this guy from the CIA, or is the umbrella a type of gun? And, umbrellas were contraband. So I had to leave an umbrella in the locker each morning. And I thought, what am I going to use for the umbrella man? I thought, well, I've got a banana in my bag. So instead of holding up the umbrella to the boys, I held up a banana, and they all looked at me and go, why the hell are you holding a banana above your head? So I just used moments like that to put a little twist on history lessons.
Music was the most popular subject at Parkville, and there was a funny moment where a student said they wanted to learn about classical music, by which they meant Tupac. But why is music so important to those boys?
I think they really connect with the stories that are told in music, and a lot of them very creative, great with words, and poets in their own right. So they enjoy expressing themselves through poetry, through music. And I talked a lot about drill music, which I had no idea about. The first music lesson I taught, I included Jay-Z, and I thought, I'm really getting with the youth here by including Jay-Z, and they just walked out. They said, dead haps, Jay-Z is not 100, he's not 100% genuine. They were right into drill music, which, for your listeners who haven't heard of it, it's a subgenre of hip-hop, but very hardcore. Talks a lot about gang violence and the kind of realities that my students were engaged in, in their everyday lives. So, it was quite an eye-opening experience for me to hear bands like 1-4 from suburbs like Mount Druitt that I'd never visited in Sydney, but they really connected with the stories that these drill artists told. And it was an eye-opener for me, again, just gave a bit of context, a bit of perspective on the harsh, tough lives that they were brought up in.
You mentioned the gang dynamics that you saw in jail. What was your sense of that, and how people, teachers, institutions should handle that sort of gang culture? Because it seems like it has a big influence on the boys you encountered.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Stan told me at least 90% of the young people in Parkville are members of gangs. So it's a major issue in communities in Melbourne, and I'm sure around Australia. And a lot of them would, when they were released, they returned to their gangs, and then sure enough, they'd be back in Parkville before long. But I think for a lot of these boys, they don't have the stable home life that I took for granted. Victims of abuse and neglect. And so it's natural for them to cling to a sense of belonging that gangs can provide, and a potential way out of poverty and the types of challenges that they face.
Ralph, you saw some little wins along the way. Like, there were some really moving moments actually where you felt like you're making a bit of a connection. But I wonder, what was your overall sense of this environment that you were in and that these boys are in, and the sort of the cycle that they're part of as well? Did you come away from the experience optimistic or sort of hopeful, or not? Like, I'm just interested in your sort of way you processed this as you look back. I mean, perhaps writing the book was part of that process, but what was your overall sense by the end of this?
Yeah, I think overall I did come away with a sense of optimism. I think the thing that surprised me most was the hunger for education on the part of the boys. Jimmy being a classic example, but there was another boy who he wanted to be a Sparky, and he had this dream of becoming an electrician, but he'd missed a lot of school, felt that he wasn't good enough at maths to do that. So he just wanted to become a construction worker. And I worked on maths with this boy, and by the end of his time in remand, I was told that he now, instead of wanting to go straight to a construction site, he wanted to go back and do year 10 because he felt that he could do maths. He felt that that dream of becoming a Sparky was still a possibility. So I felt, there was this overall, I would say, and it took time, but a very positive response to the possibilities that opened up for them through the school. The problem was, and it's an ongoing problem, is that because of systemic failures, chronic staffing shortages, boys were not allowed to come up to class a lot of the time. There just wasn't the staff to bring them up to class. So boys all young people in Parkville are being denied that access to education, and the precinct is using things like isolation and solitary confinement in response to those staffing shortages. And I think that creates huge problems. And if that can be overcome, then I'm very optimistic for the future and the impact that regular education and access to good people, other mentors like the youth justice workers, can have on these young people.
They need education. I think, we very much would agree on that. What else do they need, though? That's one piece of the puzzle. What else do these young people need?
Well, education in its broader sense. So there's the breakthroughs that you can have in the classroom, but I think as important, or perhaps even more important, is the access to good people who make a difference in their lives. And I saw people like Stan just spend hour after hour talking to young people and listening to young people. And those sorts of people, whether in the precinct or out in the community, I would put that definitely on a par with traditional education and being in the classroom in terms of the benefit for these young people, because a lot of them just haven't had those reliable, wise adult figures in their life.
In the end, you did end up speaking to the investigative reporter, Nick McKenzie. We've had Nick on Life and Faith here, and became a whistleblower about the enforced isolation of boys in Parkville. Tell us about that and why you felt the need to take that step.
Yeah, a lot of the boys would spend a lot of time in enforced isolation or solitary confinement. So solitary confinement is when somebody in detention is isolated for 22 hours or more a day without meaningful human contact. And I felt that the Department of Justice and a lot of other teachers on the staff felt that they were misleading Parliament, misleading the public in terms of the extent of this use of isolation and solitary confinement. And I saw the damage, the psychological damage that was done to the boys. I mentioned in the book one of my students who at the start of the week was friendly, chatty through his cell window. By the end of the week of isolation and solitary confinement, it had totally changed his personality. I heard boys screaming from their rooms. These boys who have suffered acute trauma in their childhoods, the worst possible thing you can do is lock them alone day after day, hour after hour in a cell. And I just felt that I had to take action because I saw how much it damaged the boys and how much it set back all those little wins that were had in the classroom and just through regular contact with people on the staff. So that's why I decided to take action.
Perhaps we finish with this, Ralph. You mentioned a conversation with a colleague where they note that most of the boys, there's a lot of recidivism, but their goals are, you note, are often unhelpful things, like they want to be in jail with their siblings, or they get notoriety from a crime that they've done or whatever. How can teachers and people who are helping these kinds of students shift or shape their wants and their desires so that they become things that will actually lead to their flourishing?
Yeah, you mentioned that boy whose only goal was when he turned 18 to join his brother in adults. And sure enough, he turned 18, committed a crime and realised that goal, went to adults to join his brother. In a passage towards the end of the book, I mentioned Stan saying that the people in youth justice get an education one way or another when they come in. You know, they can learn to do crime better, or they can start to see possibilities away from crime. And a lot of these boys aren't aware of those possibilities. So I think it's the combination of a traditional education, but also these great mentors that they come across in the precinct who can open their eyes to a world away from crime. And a lot of these boys simply aren't aware of some of the possibilities that are available to them. And through that combination, that broad education, it's quite incredible when you see a young person suddenly realise that, oh, I could take this path, I could take that path. All the paths that, for me, in my private school education and my privileged upbringing, we were just taught those as we grew up. But a lot of these boys who spend time on the streets, or, you know, they go home at night and their parents are high on drugs, or their parents are in prison, a lot of the boys just aren't aware of those possibilities. So places like Parkville can really turn things around for a lot of these young people who are born with their hands tied behind their back.
This has been Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart. I hope you enjoyed hearing about Ralph Jackman's experiences at Parkville Youth Detention Centre. Ralph writes very compellingly about that experience in his book Detention, a rookie teacher, the toughest prison school in Australia. That's out now. Thanks for listening. And why not send this episode on to someone you know who might enjoy it? It might get them onto other episodes as well. And together we can get more people into the Life and Faith listening community. Also, leave us a rating or review, or write to us at podcast@publicchristianity.org. We'd love to hear from you. Next time.
The United States is built on two wings. One was an Enlightenment wing, and the other was a Judeo-Christian wing. The Enlightenment brought the variety of dealing with the pluralism, including the establishment of the freedom of religion against an establishment clause in religion. But you had this Judeo-Christian wing, and this is where my response has a subtlety to it. Because although the U.S. wasn't a Christian nation, Christianity was a massive cultural influence on the ethos of the country it's founding. Now look what's happened to the two wings. The Enlightenment's been challenged by postmodernism, and the Judeo-Christian element has been challenged, and that's on shaky ground depending on where you are in the country. So our plane with two wings has now become a missile.